Hi, and welcome to Knitting with QueerJoe, episode 19. Today we're going to talk about how to sew in set-in sleeves. And I have a specific technique I use, and if you'd like to go directly to the technique without hearing all the information about why set-in sleeves are a little bit more difficult to sew into a sweater, you're more than welcome to go directly down to comments, and there's a link that'll take you directly to the technique itself, so you don't have to listen to the whole intro piece of it. So let's get right into it. So once you've gotten to the point where you've finished knitting the components of your sweater, what you're left with are the sleeve, which has kind of an interesting shaped top, which is in essence rounded at the top to accommodate for the rounded shoulder section of your shoulder at the top of the sleeve. And it's got these kind of like strange notched out ends to it. And you have a kind of an oval shaped hole that you need to basically fit that shape into. A couple of the difficulties. One is, first of all, this is the top end of the bound off edge of your knitting typically, and you're attaching that to the side seam of your knitting. So attaching one type of seam to another is sometimes somewhat difficult. But the more difficult piece of this is the sleeve is going to look somewhat like this when it's sewn in. The hard part is you know where to start, because you're going to start this down here at the bottom for both edges of it. And you're going to kind of stretch this out so that it matches up with this seam. But the difficult part with it is the instructions typically tell you to ease in this section. And that easing in section is really rather difficult to do. If you've ever seen Patty Lyon's video on sewing in set-in sleeves, she has some great tips on where you can mark specific parts of your sleeve to make sure that it is set in on an even basis and there's no dimpling or ruffling of the seam where you're sewing in your seam. And I highly recommend you check out Patty Lyon's videos. I'll link to it in comments below. She also suggests using something called, I think it's called a tailor's ham. Not a tailor ham, a tailor's ham, which is kind of this cushion, this odd small shaped cushion that kind of fits directly into the sleeve of this, and it allows you to kind of even this up and do this up a little bit more evenly. I have a slightly different technique, and it requires basically two different things. It requires this piece of wire. I have this piece of wire from some of my blocking kits that I've had. I have different gauges of this wire, and this is a finer gauge sweater, so I'm using a finer gauge wire to do it. But basically what I do is I use this wire to baste in the sleeve, and I'll show you how I do that. But when I baste it in, it allows me to kind of pull it out and rebaste it with this, and so that it's exactly how I want it before I start actually seaming up and sewing up the thing. So first of all, the sewing in a sleeve is done from the inside. So we're going to take a look at turn this inside out. And I'm going to try to keep this laid out like it should be for as much as possible. And obviously the sleeve is going to have to be inside out as well. Just make sure when you're doing this that when you start that you know exactly which seam is going to what side of the sweater, because if you start seaming this in, even basting wise, and realize you have to pull it all out, it's kind of annoying. Now, typically I don't sew in or weave in my ends before I start doing this. I have woven in some of these ends, or a lot of them, and they get in the way kind of mostly the video. But I can pretty much avoid them as I'm working on this. So this is basically how we want to have the sleeve sewn in. Now there's really only two parts that we know of where the seam is actually going to get sewn in, And so we're going to be using closing stitch markers. So since I know it's going to be put into this is going to be attached down here, I'll go ahead and attach it there. And since this is folded approximately in half, we know that in my case the shoulder seam of the top of my sweater is going to attach to the midway point of the top of the sleeve. So I'm going to go ahead and attach that as well. So that's the shoulder seam on the body of the sweater, and that's the folded center of the top of the sleeve. So now those are the only 2 points where I know for certain that it's got to match up. And so this basting wire, or what I call a basting wire, allows me to pinch up the seams, or pinch up the 2 edges of the fabric, and I inserted about 2 rows down from the top, or 2 stitches down from the top, depending on what kind of edge I'm working with. And so I go along, easing in together, just back and forth. Now this bottom part of the sleeve, the top of the sleeve piece, is one of the more, or one of the most, the less even edges. So you kind of have to even that out as much as you possibly can. So you want the tops of these 2 edges from the side of the sweater and the top of the sleeve to match up as closely as possible, and put this basting wire through about 2 stitches or 2 rows below the edge of the fabric, if that makes sense. And just keep putting in about every 1/4 of an inch. 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch. I love these basting wires. I'm gonna have to see whether I can find a decent source for blocking wires and basting wires that have different gauges of wires, but this particular one came in perfectly handy for this particular sleeve. It's a fine fingering weight yarn that I used to make this sweater, and so it's a pretty fine gauge yarn, so I wanted a pretty fine gauge wire as well, so that it didn't so it would bend a little bit more. Now here's where, as I start to come to the one place where I know where it has to match up at the top, where the shoulder sleeve and the halfway part of the shoulder seam and the halfway part of the sleeve come together. Now's here where I have to just make sure that it's lining up completely. Now I seem to have done a pretty good job at getting to this point and bringing it together, so it matches up pretty well all along. And just so you're aware, since this is all stockinette, it makes it a little bit simpler because it's easier to see the edges of the stitches, although they do curl a little bit more. But I did steam block the sleeve itself. I didn't steam block the top of the sweater hole, the armhole of the sweater. Because I was going to be easing things in. And so now, since I know that this has to be together, I do that. Now, normally, if I were going to be actually doing this entire sleeve, I would go ahead and base the entire back side of the sleeve as well. But now I'm going to just show you how I, quote, sew in the sleeve seam. I do it slightly differently than most people. Most people actually sew it using some kind of sewing stitch that they prefer. I don't. I use, in this case, a pretty fine gauge crochet hook. I don't know if you can see that crochet hook, but it's relatively fine. And inserting it at the beginning part about, again, approximately 2 stitches down from the edge of the sleeve and the side of the armhole, I pull through a loop, and then I insert it about 1/8 of an inch further up along the way into both fabrics. And then taking my working yarn, I just wrap it around and pull it through both. Oops, that didn't come through. I pull it through both layers of fabric and the loop that I created, and just do what they call a slip knot in crochet. So I put it through both fabrics, making sure that I'm approximately 2 stitches or 2 rows down from the edge of that fabric, both pieces of fabric. Pull it through, and you see I start getting this little, let me show you as soon as I get it. You see I start getting this little chain stitch on this side. On this side, you can't see anything. So again, I insert it about 2 stitches below, or 2 rows below the edge of the fabric, through both pieces of fabric, and it's also through that one loop on this side. Wrap my yarn around and pull it through. I do this rather loosely. And eventually I will have this chain stitch all the way up. Now, one of the things that I didn't really show you is after I've done the basting, and I'm just going to put a little stitch marker in this stitch so that I don't lose this, so that I can continue sewing this up. But one of the things I did not show you is you can actually, your basted seam, you can kind of look to see what it's going to look like once you've basted it. Now, this looks a little bit gappy, like it has a few gaps in it and stuff like that from where I've just basted it, but you can get a sense that you're far enough into both pieces of fabric that you're not going to show any of the end seams of the fabric after you've sewn it up together. So that's basically how I do it. And the end result, and I've already done the other side, so let me show you that. The end result of sewing it up, or crocheting it up, if you will, in that way, is a really, now this has not been blocked. This is the side seam. So this is the top shoulder seam up here. And you can see that the top of it came in nicely. Now there seems to be a little bit of underarm piece that's a little bit, so you can see it's got a nice clean seam to it that looks very professional and very neat and even. So feel free to ask any questions and comments. I am very responsive when it comes to answering any questions that come in, and I'm happy to answer any here. And again, thank you for joining me for Knitting with QueerJoe. Hope to see you next time.